secular stagnation has been a central theme of the American history for a long time, at least since Frederick Jackson Turner. And it's a central topic of economic growth, reasons for economies to become developed, other economies to lag behind, and for why the American economy might stagnate or grow into the future. My name is Matías Vernengo. I'm the director of the Bucknell Institute of Public Policy, and this is Policy Parlor. We're here with Franklin Serrano. He is a professor at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. He's a specialist on economic growth and has a PhD from the University of Cambridge and has been visiting here us at Bucknell University. And he accepted graciously to talk to us about this topic. So, Franklin, thank you for being here.
Thank you.
So, first question to you. What is the traditional economic view of growth and how it differs from the demand-led growth approach that you developed?
Well, the traditional neoclassical or marginalist view of economic growth basically states that growth is a supply-driven phenomenon, and in a very specific sense, is that the growth follows the increase of the endowments of the factors of production, let's say capital and labor to make it simpler. And these factors, through the market mechanism, are combined in a way that they produce the so-called potential output through the principle of factor substitution that, by the way, in the process determines the functional distribution of income. So this process is then, when you want to see what causes growth, you would normally say, well, capital increase this, efficiency increase that, labor increase that. The big thing is that not only supply side, but the key idea is substitution, factor substitution. On the heterodox...
So you mean by that the market mechanism can adjust to get the precise and more efficient use of both capital,
yes,
labor, and land, if you were talking about that.
Yes, and in the most important, in the process, it does determine the functional distribution of income. So there is, in this way, the distribution of income that is compatible with the most efficient use of resources.
So each factor of production gets exactly its fair share. You can say
not necessarily fair, because actually, for instance, there is a lot of another factor. Even if you're very nice, your factor will not be very scarce. But the share that induces entrepreneurs to produce the maximum of the economy. That's why they say don't deal with those factor prices, with unions, other things. If you don't like the fairness of the outcome, you must have redistributive policies that should not be distortionary, because that's the idea. The factor prices in this approach are not just the distribution of prices, they are allocation prices, scarcity prices. In the other approach, none of this is true. There is very little modern available techniques, alternative. They are not necessarily selected in the traditional way for reasons that matter to us here, but basically factors are complementary. So the one that is in shortest supply is the one that matters. So potential output in our approach is determined by the supply of capital normally, because in capitalism, labor is always, there's always some way to bring labor. Now, this is one aspect. The other aspect is that even this single factor that is more scarce, so to speak, there is no guarantee that it will be fully utilized, because not only we need to have this capacity to produce, but we need to have demand. Not demand in the sense that people's needs or preference, but what we call effective demand, which is demand that, like, people have money and are willing and capable of paying the prices that include a minimum profitability requirement that is determined by the bargaining between capital and labor. So not only there is this connection between a different theory of growth and a different theory of distribution. And of course, since entrepreneurs want to get produce just to get money. So that's where the demand gets in. And now this is accepted the, for the short run in different ways by some people. But the big difference here is that in the long run, in this approach, it is the same idea because then this is because if the capital stock is what determines the potential output, the different details of a heterodox approach have to do with different explanations of investment, which is what makes the potential output grow.
Can we put some bones into this? Think a little bit about the American history. So, what would be a traditional, conventional view of the growth of the American economy? It would be, the factors of production sort of story,
Yes,
and vice versa. What would be the long run sort of story of American growth in the American economy from a demand led perspective?
Well, in the more traditional, neoclassical way, there is a lot of homogeneity. Almost everybody just do what they call growth accounting from the supply side. That they look at different historical periods and they decompose the growth in terms of how much was the increase of labor, how much was the increase of capital, and how much was so-called total factor productivity, which would be the combined thing. In the heterodox approach, I could not.
So just clarifying. So it's the amount of labor, the amount of capital, and this fuzzy measure of how efficient capital
really
and labor
not
work.
Clear. It's a theory dependent estimate. So it's really complicated. Just I can give a simple example. Like if factors are complementary, you could not do that because if you don't have one factor, its efficiency is zero. If you don't have the other, is zero. So since they say you can combine anything, then this combination doesn't exist in reality, but exists in the theory. So this strange entity, the total factor productivity, comes from that. Heterodox people don't use this concept for obvious reasons.
Fair enough. So the American economy grew because there was, more use of capital, more use of labor, but fundamentally because this
in this approach, the most important thing is just like how much output increase relative to this endowment, which is sort of puzzling because it's not really clear. Now, in the heterodox approach, you have capital accumulation as the main driver of growth, but this is driven in different ways by demand by different heterodox theories. But in any case, the productivity of labor, which is clearly definable, is not independent from capital accumulation because most innovations are what we call embodied, like workers produce more in this complementary approach because they have more and better machines. So of course it's together. That's why there's always this bargain because you don't have what one factor produces, what the other factor. There is a social process of production, and then it has this characteristic. Now, as an explanation of how this came about, so it goes back to like technical change. There is of course scientific progress and exogenous part, but the endogenous part depend on capital accumulation. So it goes back again to the theories of investment. And within this approach, there are basically two views, simplifying a lot, but there are basically two views of what determines investment in the very long run, compatible with demand-led growth. There is one view that thinks that, like to call the autonomous view of investment or animal spirits, etc., that for some reason, mainly search for more profits, innovations, and financial conditions. Entrepreneurs invest because they're optimistic, they are entrepreneurs, and that drives the whole process. This is one view that emphasizes that this increased investment not only increases demand, but that's where demand-led growth comes. Well, they also later will increase the potential output. That's why it's demand-led growth, not just the short-run fluctuations, because the potential output increases. However, since it is investment that's pulling the economy, this capital stock that will happen is not connected with the size of the market because it's just a consequence of the collective investments of entrepreneurs. This is one view. And the other view is no, like firms only invest if they think they occupy the factory, there will be demand, effective demand for the product, as called the induced investment view, which is the one I follow. And then what in the end matters is that what really increases the market independently of investment. The investment is more passive and follows in the long run, not in the cycle, but in the long run follows this so-called the components of demand, autonomous components of demand that do not create capacity default. Now, in this other approach, called the super multiplier approach, it is, if we were to interpret American growth, there's one thing that people really don't think it's very important in the case of the US. They think it's important just for short-run fluctuations, which is that at least since, you know economic history better than me, that since the US was not anymore externally constrained in some time in the 19th century, you know when, better than me.
Post-bellum. So
Post-bellum, basically post-bellum. The American economy was almost
after the Civil War.
Yeah, it was capable of producing anything after the Civil War. So there is one very important variable that people normally don't think it's important. It is the enormous increase in government expenditures. First militarily, then later the welfare state, and then both, etc. And this is not considered in other approaches an important driver of growth, but it's what allowed people to have money. Everybody talks about the big internal market in the US, but people don't produce money. So the state introduced money in the economy, either spending or through monetary policy, credit, etc. So in this approach, let's say the long run is much more similar to the usual Keynesian short run that most people accept is how the world works normally.
In one way, it's, to make it incredibly simplified, one approach is essentially markets determine things by themselves, and in the process of finding optimal outcomes, and in the other, you need either some sort of external force, the government, something to create the conditions for economic growth. So one question that it's often associated to this discussion. So if the government can do that, and the United States can eventually catch up and become not only as developed as England, but surpass it. So why a country like Brazil cannot do that? What's the difference between Brazil? So why cannot all countries experiment with demand-led growth and become all as developed as the United States?
A lot of the key thing we already mentioned briefly in the other question is the question of the foreign exchange constraint. Because if you think about development, it is true that the state can generate purchasing power in its own currency, always been true everywhere. However, I said the potential output depends on capital. Capital depends on capital goods. Developing one does not yet have a capital goods industry. So it has to import capital. Like in the case of my country, we used to export coffee to be able to import machines.
That was a little sort of thing to me. He said, in my country, it's not your country.
No, you're not a Brazilian citizen.
Look at that. So
you're American and Argentinian citizen. In my country, we had to export coffee and import machines. So it is where the fact is it's still monetary, but the problem is that there is you need international money. The money that capitalists that produce the stuff you cannot produce. So in order to do this, you have to get foreign currency. So since we're saying the US, let's say, overcame this problem a long time ago, and then later, with its military dominance, its own money was everywhere. So everybody needs American money, and the others.
And it's a slow process. In the case of the United States, from the Civil War to the First World War, first it's England that eases the United States restrictions by providing credit. And then eventually, because it depends materially from the United States provide the credit in its own currency, and that's the transition towards...
the small developing countries are all having to deal with that, and also, through the financial institutions, for instance, a lot of people discuss, commodity dependence is very bad, but for growth, because it's stable, it's true for Brazil, for smaller countries like Argentina, but New Zealand, Australia never had problems. Why? Because they had this sort of semi-political colonial status they still have, and so they always have a lender of last resort on the international money, either British pounds in the old days or dollars. So they don't have that crisis. So people do not.
So you're saying that Canada is already somewhat of 51st state of the United States.
For Canada and all the what they call 5 years countries, the ones of this intelligence alliance, and you see they're always allied with the US in all the things. There is this payback thing. We're nice to you if you're nice to them. So, for instance, Argentina or Brazil are very proud of not being dependent in other ways, and there are a lot of very good things about not being in this status. But we have shortage of foreign currency periodically.
Yes, every so often.
Yeah.
So let's think about this and economic policy in the United States. So why, there's was 10, 15 years ago, a resurgence of the discussion, in particular in the aftermath of the 2007-2009 recession, the global financial crisis, of secular stagnation in the United States. It's a theory that has a long sort of trajectory, or perhaps not so long, but going back in time. And what are, given these two different views of growth, what are the explanations for why the recovery after the Obama fiscal package was so slow, why we had secular stagnation, and why in the pandemic, which is a humongous shock, contrary to what many people expected, the American economy recovered so fast. So if we can sort of, through the lens of these two views, try to understand what happened to the United States.
The first thing is that on the broad secular, modern secular stagnation theory, now there are again two possible interpretations. One of them said because the crisis obviously was caused by financial deregulation and a lot of the bubble, etc. The autonomous investment people are saying that the reason why the economy didn't grow so much after the crisis mainly has to do with the uncertainty, the financial instability, what they call financialization, short-termism of entrepreneurs, and all this discussion about lack of stakeholders, indifferent to interest, okay, all the story. And I confess that for a while I was thinking that perhaps that was so, because it was very surprising how little the American economy had grown. But then I look at the data, and it became clear that that's something very much related to our approach, that in spite of the big discussions about the large fiscal stimulus in the Obama administration, later on, she has been, the US is more or less like a European country, very low growth of public expenditure transfer for a long time. So that why would people invest if the demand is not growing? So I think simpler this approach. Now,
so in part, the story of why the economy didn't grow is that the fiscal stimulus was too small.
I thought too. If you look at the data, yes, it was because people talk about anti-cyclical policies, right? The fiscal policy, even the autonomous investment heterodox people, they think fiscal policy is just for anti-cyclical things. No, it's pro-trend, like a stable, continuous growth in government.
It's both pro-cyclical and pro-trend.
So it's not something you need in a crisis and then forget about it, which was Obama or even Larry Summers in the past used to do.
Larry Summers was actually instrumental in making that stimulus smaller, and Christina Romer wanted almost not double, but it was like 1.2 trillion versus 800 billion.
But strangely enough, Larry Summers himself later used this complicated neoclassical interpretation to get to secular stagnation. You have a supply-led model that you have to do a lot of funny things to get to the same results we get. So, and then, of course, this shift was influential in the reaction to the pandemic in the US, have been very positive. It immediately was a big fiscal.
So, and essentially, in the complicated way, what they needed to say is that the interest rate that would make for the efficient use of capital couldn't be achieved.
Unfeasible, and therefore, as a second best, you have to do what we've been saying they should have been doing at the time. Yeah, basically it's like this. Like, in principle, you don't need it, but it's not working, so you cannot go much lower than zero. So that's what happened. But then, turn into the pandemic. Luckily enough, due to this and also the influence of the so-called modern monetary theory on the democracy, there was a very good reaction to the onset of the pandemic, because it was a crisis that had a date, so the government was ready to intervene, both monetary and fiscal policy. And that's why we saw not only a fast recovery, but it's clearly the US is back, even to a slightly higher tendency of growth. Now, unfortunately, because of this really confused disruptions of the pandemic and the some sectors had problems importing inputs and things like this, and this generated this initial inflationary shock that a lot of people, like Larry Summers, shift back to the traditional approach, said, no, this is permanent, this is horrible. But the key in this, our approach, demand and go, is that supply eventually adapts to demand. Of course, there's no reason to do such a quick expansion outside an emergency. But in an emergency, okay, it's a few, you don't know which sectors are going to respond. What you would want? Just wait until the whole economy recovered, the whole supply recovered. So it was not a mistake. It had the cost. If our view was wrong, we would have permanently higher inflation and permanent worse income distribution for the workers. This did not really happen. But for some very not directly related to these reasons, just because the Democrats didn't win the election, people are now saying, oh, this new Larry Summers, that's similar to the old Larry Summers that said you shouldn't spend so much. He was right. No, he was wrong. Everybody knew he was wrong until the eve of the election. The same people who said he was wrong after the election now are saying, oh, maybe he was right. No, if something happens, but not for the reason you put in your theory, you're not right. We're not in a guessing game.
So Larry Summers backtracked. He said the fiscal policy that he defended, that it was a mistake, the worst mistake in the last 40 years in economic policy.
Yes.
Then when Kamala was the candidate, he said, no, that was the right thing to do. And then she lost the election, and then it was the wrong thing to do.
This is the moment. Now in the US, in this moment, there was this really strange article by Furman defending without mentioning Summers, defending his approach. And he was also skeptical, so was in the middle in this period, but now he shifted back to full Larry's not like actually, original, unreconstructed Larry Summers approach. So it clearly is not very rigorous discussion.
Fair enough. So we end up with this. So instead of having secular stagnation, if you have a demand-led story, what you have is stagnation policies. So the policies of the fiscal policies
say that we, since for instance, sometimes what restrains the government, manager of the economy to generate enough demand is external constraints in some countries. Sometimes political constraints about inflation or other things. That's why we call growth is demand-led in our approach, and economic policy regime constrained. So this is institutional political constraint. Can be one way, it can be no other. So politics and the conflict are not only on the determination of distribution, but on this
process of accumulation.
State, not on growth through decisions about how
it's a complicated process in which the political economy matters.
Yes, very much.
I would finalize by saying that yesterday the U.S. Congress approved a new budget, a budget from a government that has populist tendencies, supposedly, that wants to improve the conditions of the working class. A good chunk of the working class did vote for Trump. And yet the government will give tax cuts to the very wealthy and reduce social spending for the relatively poor. It's not clear, I should say. Many people have jumped to say that implies that the economy will stop growing. We don't know that the level of growth will sort of spending, particularly on defense and other things, will come down. So it's very likely that we'll have a regime that will maintain relatively decent rates of growth, but with distributive effects that are not necessarily the ones that more progressive people would want.
Like the first term by Trump.
Yes,
you described
exactly.
The first term.
Yes, the second term may very well be very much like the first term. Thank you very much, Franklin, and we'll see you in the next podcast. Franklin did mention the relative importance of modern monetary theory for the fiscal packages that we had during the pandemic. And we will have one of the stars of modern monetary theory, Stephanie Kelton, who was an advisor to Bernie Sanders. Thank you, and until the next time.